It's time to revise. How you doing, everyone? I hope you're well and your studies are going smoothly. So, cross-cultural variation and the work of Van Ijzendoorn today. AQA Psych Paper 1, Attachment, Galbraith does Psych. Let's crack on. First, it's active revision. Here's your opportunity to blurt what you know. Grab a whiteboard, grab a bit of paper, whatever you like. What do you know about cultural variation in attachment? Pause it, come back when you're ready. Here's mine. Don't worry if you haven't quite got so much. So I've put key study there because it sort of is. Van Ijzendoorn's name is on the specification, so you are supposed to be aware of an example of his research, and it is probably the meta-analysis that you know, although he did other studies. So it is a meta-analysis, remember that secondary research, where he's got together, him and his colleague Cronenberg, 32 different examples of research that used the strange situation, gave him a sample size of almost 2,000 children across 8 different countries. They analysed data to see if there were differences between as well as within these different cultures or countries, and they found that secure was the norm universally, so that was the highest percentage everywhere. And then in the more individualistic cultures, traditionally anyway, so the sort of more westernised sort of cultures, they found that avoidant was second highest. And then in the more Eastern or collectivist, traditionally sort of cultures, resistant was the second highest. You might know some examples, don't worry too much about the percentages, but you might know that Israel and Japan were the highest for resistant, and the most avoidant was Germany. You might also know that they've actually found that there was more variation within the cultures than between them. Actually, 1.5 times more. In terms of evaluation and discussion, you could go back to your research methods and think about what's good or bad about meta-analysis. You might question this idea of collectivist and individualistic cultures, or even the fact that, it's, almost 40 years old now? Wow, that makes me feel old. And sort of question, the temporal validity. Maybe parenting has moved on since then. You might question and discuss their choice of using countries as opposed to actual cultures, because, country isn't equal to culture, is it? You might talk about culture bias associated with the strange situation itself and definitions of secure attachment. Or you might be aware of other research in terms of, I know there are Italian studies, there's a Korean study. It depends what you've learned and what books you've read. But there's a bit of a breakdown of what you might know. So moving on with our active revision today, we've been through the material, I've talked you through it, we have retrieved it, we now need to put it into practice. So here are some exam questions. You can pause the video again here. You can pick some to try, you've got marks, you've got times and stuff. Pick some to have a go at, even if you're just planning some of the bigger ones, and then press play when you're ready for me to talk through with you. Right, in Van Ijzendoorn and Cronenberg's meta-analysis, which type of attachment was found to be most common universally, so everywhere? Well, hopefully you know from when we went through it was secure. Now we don't need to explain it, it's one mark, it's just which type, so just write secure. Briefly describe the procedure of Van Ijzendoorn's research. So for 3 marks here, going back to what we retrieved earlier, focusing on the kind of research method that it was a meta-analysis, it involved collecting, a number of, 32 other studies that were already, published on the strange situation. That gave them a sample of almost 2,000 infants across 8 different countries. You could give a couple of examples there, so the US, Germany, Israel, UK, China, Sweden, so on. Okay, and sort of their aim and sort of what the process was. So they analysed data to see if there were differences between and within cultures in terms of the types of attachment that children showed. There's loads there by the time you write that up. Outline the findings of research into cultural variation for 4 marks. Okay, now it doesn't actually specify Van Ijzendoorn here, so if you know other studies, you can answer this question using those other studies. Or if you don't know enough about Van Ijzendoorn on the day, you can bring in other studies. So there you go, you've got a choice. But if you just stuck with Van Ijzendoorn, there is enough to say as well. So overall sort of trends, secure was the norm, and then avoidant was second in the more individualistic or Western ones, and resistant was the second most common generally in the more collectivist cultures. So, there's a couple of marks potentially just explaining those. You could give example percentages or example countries to elaborate on those. I would expect to see a little bit of that in the top graded responses to that question. And then potentially something that you might add in there, and again, maybe the sort of full mark responses are going to make a comment like this, is the idea that there was more variation within cultures than between them. Explain one strength and one limitation of Van Ijzendoorn's research. It does specify Van Ijzendoorn's study here, so you're going to need to stick with that. 3 marks plus 3 marks. Some ideas from what we went through earlier, I'll just elaborate on a couple of them. For a strength, you could talk about the idea of a meta-analysis. So because it's a secondary research technique and we're sort of relying on or building on other people's studies, it gives us a really large sample. Well, that means any one sort of individual that maybe was a bit anomalous or maybe behaved a bit differently on the day, or didn't complete the procedure properly. Maybe there was a child that was really upset one day and or ill, and that stuff happens. But it's not many. So if you've got a big sample, hopefully the effect of that is going to be reduced when you've got a big sample, right? So hopefully our findings on cultural variation and attachment, so I don't want to make this sound too generic, are going to be more reliable, more trustworthy overall. In terms of a limitation, you might focus on the idea that actually they were trying to look at cultural variation, and what they did is look at country variation. Country variation. Whatever the term might be there. It's not countryal, is it? That's not a word. Country variation. And I've lost my train of thought now. Where was I? And yeah, countries aren't the same as cultures. Now, you might be aware of research. I know there's a Japanese study. It might have been, was it Sagi or Takahashi? I can't remember now. Looked at maybe the difference between rural and urban populations in the same country and found a massive difference. Now, you don't have to know that example, but it does, beg the question of, is a country the same as a culture? And no, the answer is not. So what that means is that they're not actually studying what they set out to measure, which lowers the internal validity of those findings. Outline and evaluate Van Ijzendoorn's research, 8 marks. It does specify Van Ijzendoorn. You're going to split it down probably into 3 plus 5 for an A-level paper. I suppose if it was an AS question, it's more likely to be 4 plus 4. But let's prepare for 3 plus 5 anyway. In terms of your knowledge, we've been through all of this already. I'm not going to repeat all of that. It's just the procedure and the findings. In terms of your 5 discussion marks, again, we've just been through a couple of points that you could sort of turn into a bit of a discussion and say maybe one good thing is the big sample. However, even though it was a big sample, they weren't actually measuring cultures. It was countries, and sort of the discussion around that. If you felt like you needed a bit more or something alternative, you could actually say there is further supporting evidence from more modern research. You might know the Jin et al. Study, where they found that Korean families, Korean children, actually were very similar in terms of their attachment types to what they found originally with, for example, the Japanese children. And finally, discuss cultural variation in attachment for 16 marks. It doesn't specify Van Ijzendoorn here. I would argue it's incredibly difficult to tackle this question without Van Ijzendoorn, but if you know enough, you're welcome to try. So breaking it down, we've got 6 AO1 marks and we've got 10 AO3 marks. You know that. In terms of your knowledge paragraph, you're going to outline the procedure and findings of probably your Van Ijzendoorn study, throw in all the specialist terminology, all the detail you've got, any percentages, any examples of countries and stuff, chuck it all in there. If you feel like you don't know enough on the day, as I said earlier, you could throw in another example of a study if you know it. There are lots in the books. In terms of your discussion, we've talked about lots of ideas already. Is there anything we haven't really talked about yet? I suppose, yeah, that bottom one maybe. You could talk about the issue of culture bias. The strange situation came from Mary Ainsworth, remember, who was a student of John Bowlby. Now, Ainsworth is an American-Canadian. Bowlby was a British psychoanalyst. So, it's rooted in sort of Western, I was going to say Eurocentric, but it's not quite really, is it? It is very much British and American values in terms of what does secure childhood look like? What does, I suppose, even good parenting look like? And so when we apply that to other countries, other cultures, it's unfair. It can lack validity because, what's secure to one culture isn't secure to another. You might be aware of how Japanese children and parents and German children and parents vary and varied in the Van Ijzendoorn study. And you could also say maybe it creates the issue of being socially sensitive. So maybe it's leading to, unfair judgments or stereotypes about some of these other cultures in terms of their parenting. Maybe it leads, us to view Japanese children as clingy or to view German parents as cold when, that's just typical for their culture at the time, I assume. Okay, so there's lots of discussion points there. What is going to make the difference in terms of your level as well is trying to chain some of those together and have a more sophisticated discussion, thinking about your structure, thinking about lines of argument, not just, writing 5 one strength, one limitation paragraphs. All right. So we have been through some questions and we blurted earlier on. It's time for you to reflect on your performance, what happened and why, and what are your next steps. If you're looking for any other revision resources, I've got lots of free things available online. I've also got Wordsearch books and exam practice books on Amazon, links in the description. Thanks very much for listening, everyone. I hope that it went well for you if you engaged in the opportunities there. Have a lovely day. Please do consider supporting the channel, helping me help more students by clicking the like and subscribe button. If you've got any questions or comments, well, that's what the comments section's for. Have a great day, guys. See you in another video.